All right, now let's write the first integration test for this voter component. So I'm going to go to the template for this component. What are we going to test here? Anywhere we have bindings, property binding, class binding, style binding, or event binding. So here are some examples. First, we want to ensure that the total votes property is rendered properly. Here's another example. If I have upvoted, I want to make sure that we have applied this highlighted class to our icon. And here's the third test case. I want to ensure that when I click this icon, the upvote method is called and total votes is increased. So let's go to our spec file and write the first test. So it should render total votes. Now I'm going to set a couple of properties here. So component.othersVote, I'm going to set this to 20, and component.myVote to 1. Now we should expect that we have 21 in the template for this component. But where are we going to render that 21? Well, let's go back to the template for this component. So our total votes is rendered inside a span with the class vote-count. So we want to query the DOM and get a reference to this element. And to do that, we use our fixture. Remember, I told you the fixture is a wrapper around a component's instance as well as its DOM element. So fixture dot debug element, which represents the root DOM element. And from here, we can query by calling the query method. Now this query method takes a predicate, which is basically a function that returns true if some condition is met. Now with this function, we want to traverse the DOM and find the first element that matches a given criteria. So to do that, first we go on the top and import a class called by from @angular/platform-browser. Okay, now back here. For the predicate, I'm going to use by.css. And here we can pass a CSS selector. So I want to find an element with the class vote-count. Now we also have another method here, by directive. So if you have a custom directive and you want to find an element that has that directive applied to it, you can pass the directive type here. So instead of a string, we pass the directive type. Let's imagine our voter component is a custom directive. So we would pass voter component here. Very simple. Now let's revert this back. Okay, so this query method returns the first element that matches this predicate. We also have another method here called queryAll, which returns all the elements that match this predicate. Sometimes you may want to work with queryAll, but in this example, we want to work with the query method. So we get the result and store it in a variable called de, which is short for debug element. And this is a wrapper around the native HTML element that we have in JavaScript. We can get this element from de.nativeElementProperty. However, the type of this property is set to any, and I'm not sure why Angular team have set this to any instead of HTML element. Perhaps they had their own reason. So this means if we type dot here, we won't get IntelliSense. Now the workaround that is to declare a separate variable. Let's call it L of type HTML element and set it to de.nativeElement. With this, we can type L dot, and here are all the standard properties and methods available in the HTML element class. Now here we're interested in inner text property. We also have inner HTML. Sometimes you may want to work with this property. But in this example, because we are rendering simple text between our span, we're going to use inner text. So expect L.innerText to contain 21. Now I could make this test a little bit more specific. So I could use to be. But as I explained in the last section, when it comes to strings, it's better to check for the existence of something in our string as opposed to an exact match, because that would make our test very fragile. So to contain is fine. Now, if we run this test, it's going to break. Let's have a look. Save. Okay, look. Expected empty string to contain 21. What's happening here? So even though we set these properties here, 21 is not rendered in our DOM element. The reason for this is because in the production application, outside this testing environment, Angular regularly runs its change detection algorithm. So anytime we modify one of these properties in our code, Angular will be notified and it will update the corresponding DOM elements. But in this testing environment, Angular is not running its change detection. So we need to explicitly tell Angular when to perform change detection. So after I set these properties, I call fixture dot detect changes. At this point, our DOM element is updated, so we get a reference and then execute our assertion. Save, and you can see our test is now successful. Beautiful. Now let's write the second test. So back in the template, I want to write the test for this binding. So if I have upvoted, I want to make sure that we have this highlighted class applied to our icon. So it should highlight the upvote button if I have upvoted. So I'm going to set component.myVote to 1. Run change detection, fixture.detect changes. Now we need to get a reference to the corresponding DOM element. So back in the template, here's the DOM element. So I'm going to look it up using this class, glyph icon -menu -up. So once again, let debug element be fixture.debug element query by css glyph icon -menu -up. Now in this test, we don't need the native element. We can check for the existence of a class using this debug element object here. Because here we have properties like classes, or attributes, or styles, and so on. But we don't have properties like inner text and inner HTML. So for those properties, you need to get a reference to the native HTML element. So let's write our assertion. Expect de.classes. Now this is an object. I want to see if this object has a property called highlighted. So I can use the indexer syntax and access the highlighted property. And I want to expect this to be truthy. Save. All our tests are passing. Beautiful. Next, we're going to write a test around this event binding.